So I have the pleasure of introducing our first plenary speaker today, Dr. Ben Merkle. Dr. Merkle is the president of New St. Andrews College and a Senior Fellow of Theology. He holds a doctorate of philosophy in Oriental Studies and a master's in Jewish Studies from Oxford University, England. He also holds a master's degree in English literature, a Greyfriars Letter, a bachelor's of education in chemistry, and a minor in history, both from the University of Idaho. He's a teaching elder at Christ Church, Moscow, Idaho, and regularly preaches at their downtown service. Dr. Merkle is the author of The White Horse King and Defending the Trinity in the Reformed Palatinate. Please welcome Dr. Ben Merkle. Thanks, brother.
Well, good morning. It is really a pleasure and a privilege to be with you all. I'm excited for this movement in general, and I'm excited for this event specifically. When technology doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Here we go. So I'm convinced that the single biggest cultural win that evangelical Christianity has made over the past several decades has been the explosive growth of classical Christian K-12 schools. I wish I could say the same thing for Christian colleges, and in God willing, in a few decades, we will be able to say that about Christian colleges. But at this moment, I think that this explosive growth and success is limited to the K-12 schools that are led by the people in this room and the hundreds of others that are just like them. Now, when I should specify, when I'm looking for cultural wins, when I say the biggest cultural win, I'm specifically looking for the advancement and success of institutions. For years, we've watched evangelical institutions fall away. I think just to say institution, it's hard for people to not hear that as a pejorative just because we have such a pessimistic expectation for the life of our institutions. As evangelical Christians over the last century, we've watched denominations crumble, seminaries fall apart, colleges go apostate, publishing companies, political organizations. Again and again, we've grown accustomed to watching our institutions crumble. And that is why I think it's so striking when you look and you see a rising fleet of Christian institutions in the classical Christian education movement. It's striking and it's just exceptionally encouraging. But there is a reason that institutions crumble at the rate that they have been falling. There are certain dynamics that make institutional leadership very, very difficult. And I suspect that when I say something like that to this crowd, I'm preaching to the choir. You know that there are forces at play that sweep the legs out from under faithful institutional leadership. Being in that position where you have to make the calls, there are pressures at work on you that make that job very difficult. And because there are so few faithful evangelical institutions that have been around for more than a couple of decades, there's not a deep bench of leadership talent that we can draw on or learn from. Especially schools that are in a startup phase, which my guess is describes a good chunk of this room. When you're in that startup phase, you don't have a deep bench in administration, right? Public schools, which are already admin heavy, have a deep bench in that junior administrative office. They have a whole wealth of vice principals and other administrators that are down from that. So it's possible in that field to get significant institutional leadership before stepping into that number one position. You don't have that kind of bench. You might be the principal, but you're also probably the bus driver, the PE teacher, and the groundskeeper, right? There's not a whole just fleet of a big office of admin support behind you. Your qualification for the job was simply that you were the last one to say not it. We'll be honest. All this is to say that I think that your positions of leadership are extremely culturally strategic at this moment, and yet the resources and help and chance to get experience behind that surround you There's not a lot. So I think it behooves us to take time to get good at developing and nurturing leadership, in specifically institutional leadership, because this is not an easy job, but it's so critical. And just looking back a little bit, we have just a few years in our rearview mirror. We have a period where all of that went under a significant test. The year 2020 was an exceptional test of our ability to lead. I think 2020 was the year that America stepped on a rake, and everything just went silly. From George Floyd to COVID to the presidential election, there was tumult every day. And even though there was this national tumult, you as a leader of this little school suddenly had to take sides and got pulled into all of it. That tumult kept demanding that we as leaders make decisions for our educational institutions. And most of the time, when those choices were forced on you, you show up at work and all of a sudden you have to make some other huge decision, most of the time there was not clear consensus around the right decision. Your peers, your faculty, your parents, your neighbors, your pastors of the various churches that come to your school, they were all split. All of your constituencies were at war with one another, and the consequences also for getting the decision wrong included things like bankrupting your school, getting yourself thrown in jail, or possibly accidentally starting a plague that killed everyone in your town. Right? And all of that was somehow going to be your fault later on this afternoon. It's easy to lead when everyone is already going in the same direction. When consensus is easy and natural, when gaining everyone's confidence takes little to no effort, that's easy. Those are the easy days. But leadership, when there's conflict and there's ambiguity, where, as my father-in-law always says, the ball always falls on the line. You show up, you have to make a decision, and the ball always hits dead center on the line. Now you get to decide, is that in or is that out? You have to lead at that moment, and there's conflict all around, and there's ambiguity. The clear answer is not obvious. Leading in conflict and ambiguity is difficult. When there is no consensus and when suspicions abound, when every motive is supplied for you and filled in with deep suspicion about your deeply debauched motivations for why you would make that decision. But that's the kind of leadership that we need to develop if we want to keep our institutions through moments of cultural crisis. Moments like 2020 in our rearview mirror, and moments like whatever it is that's coming next. Because be assured, God is bringing something soon, and you got to be ready for that as well. So what I did is, this is just an assortment of random pieces of advice that I'm hopeful when it is piled up makes a coherent message on leadership. So hopefully this is kind of ordered in a way that makes sense, but these are a few things that I've pieced together in my brief time at New St. Andrews. Some from having done things right, and mostly from having done things wrong. And then you go, okay, so next time I will do it different than that. So here it all is. My first piece of advice is when you know the moment when something has been delivered to you and like, okay, this is going to be another controversy. This is another hotly contested, contentious decision that I have to make. When you step in, when you feel that moment dawn, when the email shows up or the secretary comes in and tells you this has happened, I would encourage you to learn the instinct of taking a moment to consciously ensure that you do not resent the conflict. Do not resent conflict. Conflict is coming. It's what you signed up for. It was in your work agreement, whether they made it explicit or if it was just implicit. When you signed that, you signed up for conflict. Do not resent conflict when it comes to you. James tells us, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials." And James encourages us to rejoice in trials because we understand that God has a purpose for us when he sends trials to us. Whatever conflict is being given to you, if you were to go back into the footnotes of this conflict being sent to you, what you would find is God writing a special prescription for you, assigning this custom made for you. It's from God. It's for you. To resent it is unseemly. Okay, so consciously be sure that you do not allow yourself to resent conflict. Hebrews tells us that God chastens those whom he loves. If he loves you, he sends you hard times. And it's the way he lets you know that he loves you. Now, most likely, when I say that, you already appreciate the theological truth here. You could give that same message that that God, when we have hard times, these are from God. That teaching is nothing new. But frequently, the theological truth has not made it all the way into your DNA, such that you know how to really act like this is true. So my encouragement to you to understand what it means to act like this is true is when conflict arises, take a moment to consciously, privately pray to God and thank him for the conflict. Go use the restroom, find a quiet place to yourself, and force yourself to say a prayer of thanksgiving for whatever it is that's happening, because it's good and it's for you. And determine in your heart, as you pray that prayer, that this conflict is a good gift from a Father who is determined good for you. Setting that determination radically changes your demeanor and your ability to process whatever follows next. And you will find that when the conflict happens, of course, the next thing that happens is the boss needs to get up and address it in front of everyone. If you've done this work of thanking God beforehand, before you get up for this moment, it radically changes your demeanor and everything that flows from that. You are now equipped to handle it, and people can see it in you. You're not rattled, you're not fazed, you're grateful, you're happy, and you're in a good place. That actually will empower you to lead others in the following moments. And another thing I would suggest that you do in that moment when you thank God for this is it's always handy to keep a little list in your mind somewhere of the many times when things have gone south before, you thought it was all over, and then God miraculously delivered you and supplied a great, deliverance. Have 4 or 5 of those in your mind and rehearse them at that moment. Recount God's faithfulness to you, so that you know what you're kind of expecting to happen with this conflict. God is good. He uses these conflicts to do good to me. I've seen it these 5 times in the past, and I'm ready for it now. That makes you a different kind of leader. When I look back at the times of conflict and controversy that I've seen in Moscow over the years, we've had a few, I'm shocked at how consistently God's tangible blessings regularly followed hard times and hard decisions. God doesn't just preserve you through conflict. God uses conflict to bless you. All of the greatest moments of growth and fruitfulness that I've seen in the institutions I've been at have followed on the heels of very difficult moments of decision-making in conflict. So don't feel like something has gone wrong when conflict erupts. More likely than not, for you to be in a position of leadership at a moment of conflict arises means that you've actually done something right. Okay, so don't think it's broken, think it's working. This is just exactly what I was promised would happen. So I'll repeat the advice. Do not resent the conflict. Consciously look for places in your heart where that resentment is trying to find a foothold and get rid of it. When you step up to lead with joy and gratitude, and that attitude alone will make everyone else naturally want to fall behind your leadership. Next, don't succumb to the belief that this conflict can be managed away. By managed, what I mean is magically turned into something other than a conflict through some sort of super savvy PR move. Okay? There is this idea, and I think it's a mythology that has been created, that somehow really gifted leaders know how to use PR such that they can manage a conflict away. This is something, it's something that showed up in our TV shows, and from there has entered into our expectation of reality. TV shows they've created this illusion that there are people who possess the skill of being fixers. Right? You know, the fixer that shows up in the TV show. Essentially, these are people who possess an expertise in handling controversy such that they can make controversy go away. They can make it just evaporate and go away. And they always know how to get ahead of the media or get ahead of certain news cycles. And they know how to get ahead of certain media pieces, and they can work like an expert on the curling team. You know, that weird sport where you slide the thing and then the people are running ahead and smoothing and roughing it out to make this thing go exactly where they want it. Our expectation is that there are these fixers that can do that with the media. They can run out ahead, and they can handle it in just such a way that this news cycle completely misses the controversy. Okay, just take a moment to step back and think about what is going on with both Donald Trump and with Joe Biden. Okay, if there was such a thing as a fixer who could make your media stuff go away, would we be having the media cycles that we're having? This is pure mythology. It does not exist, and it's important that you understand that it is fiction. It's TV. So don't buy the myth that you can get ahead of all controversy. Now, there are certainly right and wrong ways to handle a conflict. You can definitely make it worse by the way you handle yourself in announcements and things like that. Yes, you can absolutely make it worse, but don't think that you can make it go away simply by the finesse of how you handle it. The mere existence of the conflict, in other words, does not mean that you have failed or are failing. This is why I think that mythology of the fixer can be so dangerous. Because in that world, in that imaginary world, it means that if there is such a thing as a fixer, if there is such a thing as being able to manage these things away, then if there is an ongoing conflict, it means that you are failing, right? If there's something that is playing out that is controversial, and you haven't somehow gotten ahead of it and made it go away, then you have failed. But I'm telling you, that's an unrealistic expectation. That fixer doesn't exist, and the fact that this controversy is going on does not mean that you are failing, right? Sometimes when these things happen, there's 12 days that have to be like this, and you have to just endure and persevere and lead through it, even though it's all really bad. And there's not anything you can do to just make it magically go away. Quick side note, you'll notice that when you're in the midst of conflict, almost immediately the conflict becomes not about the actual conflict, but about the management of the conflict, right? You had something terrible happen with a faculty member, and that lasted 15 minutes, the controversy there, and then you have 3 weeks of controversy about how the school handled it. And what's funny is that, like, what the school did, if you made a mistake, it paled in comparison to this over here, and yet that's the thing that dominates the news cycle. And I think this is, again, because we have this myth that somehow, if we're still talking about this, if we're still upset about this, it's because somebody somewhere hasn't managed the conversation rightly. Okay, that, again, is pure myth. Oftentimes there's going to be more focus and criticism of your management of a crisis or your messaging around a crisis than there actually is on the crisis itself. And there's nothing I can say to make that go away. But hopefully what I can do is adjust your expectation and give you the realization this is just necessarily how it's supposed to be. You're supposed to get them up front. You're supposed to keep leading. You're supposed to direct everybody and give them an understanding of how they should think about this. You make your decisions and you plod forward, and people will critique it and critique it and critique it. That's just the job, and you keep going. Don't think that anything has gone wrong because the controversy continues to swirl around you for a couple weeks. Sometimes it's just the nature of the news cycle, and it's going to keep swirling around you until something happens. If Trump does something over there, and now all of a sudden they can talk about something else and you're done. But it's not that you're doing anything wrong. Next, when it comes to decision making in a crisis, and that's kind of really what this is all about. You're called to actually make decisions at a moment where crisis and ambiguity is all around. So when it comes to actual decision making, I want to give you a few pointers here. And the first, though, is the big disappointing qualification that there's no silver bullet, there's no simple formula for how you make a decision. There's no way I can tell you, oh, here's the trick, here's how you do it, and this will make it all really, really easily. That's disappointing. There's no formula or process for guaranteed good decision making all the time. But the point here is, each of you, whatever position you have of leadership, you were promoted and put into that position because somebody somewhere thought you had an innate sense of judgment that they trusted. That's why you are hired, because you have an innate intuition about the decision that ought to be made, and people have said, that's the one we want leading this institution. If we could automate that, if I could convert that to a formula or something that just automatically cranked out that decision, you're all out of jobs. Okay, we can hire a robot to do your job. No, you're in your position because you can do that. You were selected to make this decision, and so I can't replace that for you or give you some way of making that decision much easier. I can give you a few pointers around how to think about your decision making. Here are a couple. First of all, beware of seeking consensus. Beware of seeking consensus. There will always be a crowd of advisors who are trying to manage your decision making. There are always people who start to circle around you who believe they can push you, pull you in one way or another. And they're going to start trying to manage your decision making. They're not, but this is the key thing. You need to constantly realize as you're hearing all this advice from these people, realize that not one of them has to stand in front of the board and be responsible for this decision. They can give you all their advice, they can give you all their opinions, but what they cannot give you is the ability for you to step out from under the responsibility for your decision. So any advice you get, it can only go so far, because in the end, you have to own it. Do not outsource your decision making to the consensus in the room, because the room will not stand before the board for this decision. You will. All those people insisting they know how this should go, when you have to stand before the board and give an account for your decision, I promise that they will all melt away, and it will be just you standing there all by yourself. So do not allow your decision-making function to be crowdsourced, okay? You can get counselors, but don't manage by seeking consensus with your advisors. And people will steer you by creating an imaginary huge consensus. You'll notice this, and you should look out for this. When somebody is sitting there trying to convince you why you ought to go in this direction, they'll describe this huge world, this sea of people that everybody knows this. Everybody knows X. Everybody knows Y. Everybody feels this way. It's you and you alone that are doing this. You need to conform to this huge consensus of people. It's imaginary. They've come up with that, all right? It doesn't exist, and you need to dismiss that. Don't allow yourself to be managed like that. You were put in this position because your personal judgment was hired for this job. If they just needed public consensus, if the board just needed a decision-making tool that would manifest public consensus on every question, they could have hired a pollster to do your job. They hired you for your intuition, and you need to exert it. You owe it to them. So that's the first thing. Don't manage by consensus. Another one, beware of the instinct to be safe rather than to be right. Okay? Beware of the instinct to be safe rather than to be right. Put this another way. Don't substitute a right decision with a defensible decision. Those are two different things, and what we do is we conflate them all the time, or we sort of quietly substitute the defensible decision in for the right decision. So this happens when you are more concerned with being able to justify a wrong decision than you are with having made the right decision. Okay? Let's say you have a contentious thing in front of you. Are you concerned about having to justify your decision to others? And so as I make this decision, I'm coming up with all of the footnotes to justify why I made this decision. Or are you just trying to make the right decision? This is the thing that I think is right. Those are two different questions. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have to make a hire. There's a hire that you have to make. And you have a strong instinct that candidate A has exactly what you need. Candidate A, you feel it. This is the guy we need, all right? But candidate B has the resume that ticks all the boxes, okay? Now, 2 years later, you're going to have to answer for the decision made for this hire. Do you want to say, yes, my judgment call was right or was wrong? Or do you want to say, well, his CV had all of this, and so I had to pick him? Okay? Are you looking for the decision that you can justify later on, or are you looking for the decision that you believe is right? Do you make the right decision or the defensible decision? Do you make the call that you think actually has the best odds of success, or do you make the call that is defensible on paper even though you suspect it will not work? Okay, that's an exaggerated scenario, but my point is to ask yourself, when you're making a decision, what is the motivation behind this decision? Are you, as you look at a decision, it's natural to fear being wrong. Okay, you're sitting here, and this is a controversial thing. I have to make this call. It's natural to fear being wrong. And more specific than that fear, you fear having to explain your bad decision in front of others. You're going to have to own this in front of others. And so what you've got to do, what the temptation to do is to look for policies, regulations, and other external guides and give them an exaggerated role in the process such that they determine your decision for you. Now, when you are wrong, you can point not to your decision but to those policies. I had to do it because of these policies. They essentially forced your decision. But when you do this, you're no longer trying to make the right decision. You're trying to make the defensible decision, okay? The safe decision. You're not looking for the best result. You are, in fact, steering yourself into the bad result with the best alibi. So it's dangerous when you start doing your decision-making calculus like that. I would urge you, aim to be right. Don't try to have an alibi. Aim to be right and not just to have an alibi. Number 3, beware of throwing others under the bus. Look out for that impulse to throw others under the bus. To be the head, which is what you are as a leader, okay, is to represent the whole body. The head represents the body. You speak as a representative for your whole institution. So own it. Own it. Speak as the head of a united body, and do not chop up members of the body and throw them over to the wolves. To take responsibility is a glory. Okay? To be the head is a glory, and to take responsibility is a glory. This covenantal glory, what I'm describing, this glory of assuming responsibility as a head for the corporate body, will get tested when some other body part does something stupid and brings blame onto the body. And when that happens, your temptation will be to put distance between you and the offending employee. You'll want to throw them under the bus. It's a logical self-preservation kind of instinct that will come in. Let's say somebody, these are examples that strike a little too close to home sometimes. Let's say someone on the marketing team sent out an email that was a complete and total embarrassment. Okay, it happens. And your face and your name are all over it. And now you just look like a dork. Your face is all over it. You didn't write it. You would never have let that go out if you had seen it. But as the leader, you are the one who everyone credits for it. And by credit, what I really mean is blame. People call you and tell you, like, what? How could you do this? This happens. The more your institution grows, and the more you become the leader, you become. I joke with my wife. It's like sometimes I feel like I'm Moscow's complaint box. It's crazy the complaints I get for things that have nothing to do with NSA, and that somehow I'm responsible for that over there. You become the complaint box for your institution, and you get credited for all of these things. At this moment, resist the urge to throw your marketing team under the bus. Be the head. Be the head of a body. Stand up and say, we did that wrong. We screwed up. We did that wrong. But say we, right? And own it. You are a part of that group, and you are speaking for it. We did that wrong. We're going to try to do better. We're going to get better. We're going to improve that. We'll take care of that. Say we. Maybe behind the scenes, some heads have to roll. Sometimes that has to happen behind the scenes. But don't do this publicly. Don't do it as a way to try to gain credit from others outside. It's a very short-sighted way to make yourself feel bigger. Okay? In the long run, you've made yourself much, much smaller. You've become a smaller person and a smaller institution when you behave like that. It will feel like you'll be a little bit bigger in the short run, but in the long run, you become smaller. Okay? Understand that this demeanor of assuming responsibility, even over really dumb mistakes, is a glory to you. That is you being big-hearted and noble. You'll feel like a little dork having to assume responsibility for something nitwitted. But you need to understand that in that moment that you take that responsibility onto yourself, your standing inside the institution goes way up and you become the clear head. Right? You strengthen your ability to lead that institution. One variation of the throwing people under the bus that also I think is worth mentioning here is the impulse to blame the previous institution, the previous administration. Your predecessor, whoever had this job before you, or the team that was here before you. Especially in your first several years of stepping into the job and into the leadership position, there's a constant possibility of getting a cheap ego boost by pointing out things from the previous leadership that have failed. And I would really urge you to just mortify that instinct, okay? There's always this desire to say, well, that's because they didn't think of this, or they foolishly pursued this initiative. There's this desire to, again, make yourself feel a little bigger by throwing the previous leadership under the bus. Understand now that that's a small man's move. That's small. You're being small-minded when you behave like that. This is a personal pet peeve for me, because the thing is, you stand on the shoulders of those that went before you and built what you now have. You have this desk because they built it. You have this job because they built all of this. And they sacrificed to do all of this, and then you step into their world and then throw them under the bus. That's really being petty and small. Don't allow yourself to go there. Perhaps you see things now that they didn't see. Perhaps could not have seen from where they stood. But to throw them under the bus is the move of a very small person. Also, remember, your leadership is modeling now to your juniors how you want them to treat you when they take your place. Okay? How you treat your predecessor is a really good model and lesson for those that follow you and how they're going to treat you when you step out. So I would say where there were mistakes from the previous administration, to the extent that you can, cover it with love and grace. Cover it with love and grace, and to the extent that you can, when you're publicly speaking about your predecessors, speak with respect, appreciation, and admiration and gratitude. That in the long run, you will make your institution so much stronger when you set up this expectation of consistent transition of leadership without having to rip the thing in half and having to hate itself. To throw them under the bus, as I said, is a small man's move. Next one. This is an image I have to unpack a little bit. A bad shoot does not become a good shoot. A bad shoot does not become a good shoot. When I was in high school, I remember a church camp, and the speaker was telling us the story of he went parachuting, and he said before they go parachuting, they tell him that when you jump out of the plane, you look up and you see if your chute opened, and if it didn't open, then you pull the little thing so that your reserve chute will open. And they said one thing to remember is if it's a bad chute, if it's not blossoming open, then it won't ever become a good chute. And you need to know that, because you need to act decisively and quickly if your chute hasn't opened. And the reason he tells us a story is because, of course, he jumps out of the plane and his chute doesn't open. And he becomes transfixed, just staring at the chute. And he describes at length, it's like a 45-minute talk, and he's describing this whole time, just staring at the chute, thinking maybe it will open, and nervous that if he pulls this, for the backup chute, it's going to release this one, and he'll have lost an entire parachute. And do you really want to go to that reserve right now? And maybe it'll open, and all this time he's plummeting thousands of feet. He manages to pull it right at the last minute, and he survives. Strangely, he was able to give the talk. But I remember that image and just thinking, like, how weird is it to just sit and stare at something that's not working as you plummet into the ground and have right there the mechanism for addressing this. And then all of a sudden you have a problem employee. You know, you have somebody on your staff where you go, okay, this isn't working. And I start hearing that saying again in my mind, a bad shoot does not become a good shoot. And I can't tell you how many times I've sat there with an employee where it wasn't working, and I've let it go so far past when I should have addressed it. Because I'm constantly thinking, maybe tomorrow he will not have this problem. Maybe tomorrow he'll figure this out and stop doing this to other people. Maybe, and the whole time we're plummeting all the way down as you sit there thinking, but maybe somehow this can be fixed. Let me encourage you, a bad shoot doesn't become a good shoot. If you have a problem employee, address it. Just address it. And one of the weird things that I've discovered is, it's not all the time, but it's more than 50% of the time when I finally had to go and take somebody and say, listen, you're not right in this position. This isn't working out, and I've got to let you go. Never is that a fun time. I'm pretty much 0 out of 100 is that fun. But better than 50%, I've had that person come back to me 6 months or a year later and say, thank you. You were right. I was in the wrong spot. And now that you got me out of there, now I'm actually in the place where I'm thriving, and I'm so grateful for that. It's definitely not 100% of people. Sometimes they still don't want to talk to you 5 years later. But it's surprising how often when you address a person who's in the wrong spot and not thriving, you're actually blessing them. You're actually ministering to them as well. They might not know it at the time, and they might not ever know it, but you're doing right to them. You're doing good to them. So a bad shoot doesn't become a good shoot. Address it when you have a problem. Another really important discipline that you need to get down is that of communication. It's really important that you think clearly, not just about decision making, but also about the communication of those decisions. If you've not read, there's a Tim Keller article that's gone around many times. I'm sure most of you have read it, but if you haven't read, Tim Keller has this article, Leadership and Church Size Dynamics. Leadership and Church Size Dynamics. If you've not read that, I highly encourage you to read it. He's describing dynamics that are going on in church sizes, but when I read it, it was, this is my college. This is exactly everything that has happened to me, and there's so much that I could have done much better had I read this earlier. One dynamic that he notes is the larger that you become, the more redundancy of communication is needed. As you grow, you have to not just adequately communicate, you have to supersaturate with communication. What was once adequately conveyed through simple chats by the water cooler when you were one size, now needs to be deliberate, and official channels of communication have to be established when you're another side. When there are gaps in your communication, the silence is often filled in with silent suspicion. And it's frustrating, but people supply nefarious motives for why something is happening when you haven't clearly communicated to them. And I say it's frustrating because the people who are supplying these nefarious motives are good friends of yours, people that you think that you have a close friendship with. But this is just the way the world works. Suspicion starts to creep in when you don't have clear communication. And this is what happens if your school is in growth mode. And as I would guess a whole bunch of you are, I'm sure the majority of this room is in a significant growth mode. That means you're passing key size milestones like clockwork. Like really quickly, you're passing key size milestones, and you don't notice that this form of communication that you had that worked when you were a school of 60, and now you're a school of 220, this form doesn't work here. And now you're a school of 500 or 700. Your habits and methods of communication are not adequate for the size of the institution that you have. Work to establish key paths of communication for day-to-day announcements, and then once you have those tools all established and everybody's using them, then when something big happens, when there's a big conflict, now you have the obvious channels to immediately go to actually address the problem. You should have social media channels. You should have an email list. It's good if you have your email list segmented so that you can you can break it out to faculty and staff, to alumni, to parents, to donors or to pastors of churches that send their kids to your school so that you can have a tag and you can say, now this message goes to them. It's nice to have a segmented list because different controversies might rate varying levels of response. This needs to just go to parents. This needs to just go to faculty and staff. And you want to have it broken out like that. To blast something too broadly can make it way worse of a deal than it needed to be. I'm assuming you have your regular faculty staff meetings, but one thing that's helpful is to schedule regular meetings where you are going to step out of the weekly meeting liturgy and cover bigger picture questions. We have the obvious weekly meetings, but then we have a quarterly faculty and staff lunch where I'm going to take something that is a big project of the school and walk through so that everybody can understand it. I noticed this a little while ago where I took our fundraising strategy and broke it down for faculty and staff. And it was funny because there were certain things that I thought were no-brainers that I didn't realize they didn't know, and it made a huge difference for them to hear it. Like, for one thing was to tell them, over the last several years, we've grown a significant fundraising department. As we've grown in size, we're much more ambitious in fundraising. So you grow this fundraising department, and these people are on planes flying everywhere, talking with donors, taking them out for dinner and whatnot. And when I showed them the budget and explained how, fundraising, the first thing they have to do is they have to raise their own budget. They have to raise their own money to support their work. Then they raise all the scholarships for the school, and then they raise all the capital funds for building improvement and whatnot. And here's how it all works. Well, the realization that the fundraising team had to raise their own budget was news to a lot of people. And it suddenly is very relieving when you know, tuition dollars aren't going to pay for some dinner over there. And I understand why that would be a concern, but I wouldn't have thought that anybody would think that. But walking through some clear principles like that, all of a sudden everybody's really at ease. And so having quarterly meetings where you're going to walk through and get to questions that maybe are a little bit uncomfortable for some people, you want to do that so you can clear all the suspicion out of the room. Like I said, once you have these channels established for day-to-day communication, then use them consistently when you're in the midst of conflict. Okay, make sure that when you're in conflict, that you're speaking to your people about it. You're the head of the institution, and the institution needs to see and hear from the head during times of conflict. Even if you have nothing substantive to say, when there is a moment of conflict, your institution still needs you speaking during that time. I remember 2 years ago, I'm on the road. I think I'm like somewhere between Minneapolis and Omaha or something like that. And I get word that back in Moscow, this is November of 2022, there's this horrific crime that is committed in our town. And it makes national news. You might have heard of it. But there's this, somebody crept into an apartment where college students were sleeping. The University of Idaho is right next to us. We have NSA and U of I right there. And it was 4 U of I college students. Somebody crept in and stabbed 4 students, murdered them in their beds at night, and crept out. And there's no suspects, and there's no clues. Nobody's arrested. There's just 4 butchered college students and a murderer somewhere in Moscow. And so I'm on the road, so I fly home, and that Friday we have our Disputate, which is our weekly assembly, and everybody's like, well, you got to get up and speak, and you have to address this. And the question everybody wants me to address is Moscow safe? Is Moscow safe? And I'm sitting there thinking, what kind of stupid question is that? Like, obviously not. I mean, like, how do you say, like, yeah, there's a guy who creeps into your house at night, stabs you, he's loose, we don't know where he is. How are you going to say, is Moscow safe at a moment like that? And I remember just being like really frustrated and kind of resenting that this burden was on me to stand up and address something that is ridiculous. But then it kind of dawned on me, they don't need me to lie to them. What they need me to do is publicly process this. And that's all that needed to happen, was for somebody to step up, acknowledge sort of the situation where we are, and handle it. No, Moscow is not safe. Moscow is not safe. But Moscow is no more dangerous than it was the night before this murder happened. Okay? If you'd asked me the night before this murder happened, is Moscow safe? If I'd answered yes, I would have been wrong. Okay? No, it's not safe, but it's no more dangerous than it was, 24 hours before. And we live in a world of uncertainty, but we have a certain faith, right? It's an uncertain world, but we have a certain faith, and that certain faith makes sense of this world. And it was kind of interesting to speak to this crowd because this is 2022, meaning I have a room full of students who are recruited to Moscow because we did not wear masks during the pandemic and we didn't require vaccines. So you're the people who said, listen, we need to embrace the danger and live free at this moment. And here's another opportunity to apply that. All right, and suddenly you start to see all the applications and whatnot, and you make sense of it. But my point is just, if you're the leader, it's your job to stand up and make sense. Okay, you have to communicate. You're the head, you're the mouth, you're the voice, and you have to process these things for the people. So get yourself to the microphone and give them the message that they need. Last point, and this is the single biggest piece of advice that I can give you to be able to handle leadership in times of conflict, is to cultivate your personal relationship with God above all else. When I am in a position where I need to make a difficult decision, and by difficult I mean a contentious decision that's clouded by ambiguity and loaded with conflict, right? When I have that, and you get those just regularly, I find that in order to be at peace with my decision, to be at peace with my decision is synonymous with being at peace with God. Those two things just always line up perfectly. If I want to be at peace with my decision, I need to make sure I'm at peace with God. If I want to be an effective decision maker, I have to be in a settled and confident position with God. And that means for me to handle decisions under stress right, I have to prioritize the basics: reading my Bible, confessing my sins, and being in fellowship with my wife and my family. When I have to make a big decision and I'm uneasy with my determination, my secret hack that I do every time is I go for a walk. I walk out of the office. Moscow is a great place for this, lots of trails. And I walk and pray until it's all settled, until everything is taken care of. And when I do that, at least at the beginning, I don't worry about the decision that I'm contemplating, at least not at first. I walk through my heart and I make sure that everything in my heart is submitted to God's word. You just walk through and do a personal inventory. Is everything where it needs to be? And this could very likely mean that I need to now call my wife and apologize for something, because you're putting everything right. You want to make sure that your heart is where it ought to be. But I want to make sure that the desires of my heart are clearly ordered to God and to His word, and that this is unambiguous throughout my heart. Okay, and once I'm there, and then I walk through the decision and pray through the decision until I'm at peace with my decision. And that could take anywhere from 15 minutes to a couple of hours until I can walk back in the office and I'm at peace with my decision. This is what we're going to do. I'm not theologically charismatic, so I don't get supernatural revelations or the gift of tongues or anything like that, but I do believe in the Holy Spirit. And when my heart is filled with the Spirit, that's when I'm equipped to make a decision and to be at peace with it. And so I think that the single biggest skill that you can have as a leader of an institution is the ability to understand how to direct the gaze of your heart to the right hand of God. To be able to see that clearly and to be at peace with that. Because if you have that, it's crazy what other tumult you can handle. Okay, you're Peter looking at Christ walking on water when you're in that kind of moment. And so I would encourage you to cultivate that as your number one leadership skill, to be at peace with God and to make sure you have a clear vision of Him, and then let all of your decision making flow subsequent to that. In my experience, the single most powerful thing that you can have in order to lead well through ambiguity and conflict is to simply be under the blessing of God. Okay? To simply be under the blessing of God. If you have to choose between having a really gifted decision-making intuition and instinct, like the ability to just always know exactly the right thing and have uber confidence in it. If you can choose between that or B, being under the blessing of God, choose B every time. Choose B every time. I see this again and again in decision making with the men around me. I see men frequently who make decisions that I sit there and I go, I've read all the books about leadership and management. I know that in every possible way, that's a dumb thing to do. It doesn't work. All the strategy is wrong. It's dumb in every possible way. And then all of a sudden, it works. And it's not just it works, it's blessed, and it becomes amazing. And as I go over this, I keep going back and seeing the single biggest thing, honestly, is not your, how many of these kinds of conferences you've gone to, how many management books you've read. It honestly comes down to be under the blessing of God. If your institution is under the blessing of God, you can make some really stupid decisions, and God causes all things to work together for good. And he makes it something that is blessed. The men whose leadership I am most impressed by do not exude a constant clarity of decision-making instinct. Prioritize instead being at peace with God above all else, because that's where your heart is guarded by that peace that surpasses understanding. And that's, being able to sleep at night is one of the biggest gifts when you're a leader managing conflict. Being able to sleep at night, that's how you know, okay, I'm at peace with God, He's with me, I can set this aside, and I can sleep the sleep of the just. That's what you want to seek above all else. To be guarded by the peace that passes understanding is the greatest gift that a leader can have. Let me just close in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for your great kindness to us. We thank you for the many institutions that are represented here. We thank you for the many children's lives who are being shaped and transformed by these institutions, for the generational blessing that you've poured out on us through this work. I ask for your blessing on each of the leaders here, their institutions, and commit them to you. And praise things in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.